I will say welcome to this farewell lecture. Welcome, Keith, and welcome to the audience. This is the fourth year that you are here, Keith.
Yeah.
You've been adjunct professor with us for 4 years and have, in that way, actually been part of the establishment, the foundation of FNUG and the growth from approximately 3 people to more than 30 people in 5 years, and have shared your experience of doing similar and maybe also larger growths at Stanford, where you and I met each other in 2012, where you were the director of the H-Star Institute, and I was a postdoc researcher who went to Stanford to study for 4 months in a program that wanted to bridge the humanities and the sciences and technology. And one of the many really wonderful things that came out of that is that you are here now and have been here for 4 years and have, in your own words, have come to love Odense. Actually, you and Jan have been here together for 4 months now in total. And you mentioned recently that you were actually considering buying something in Odense. I don't know if that's actually true, but or maybe it was just
coming back at the very least. Yes.
Yeah. Anyway, it's been lovely to have you here, and one of the things that we have benefited from with that is your willingness to share your experiences, your network, and to speak with both students and younger scholars, and also in our collegial faculty group. And Gitte and Chunfang and I have been working together with you for 4 years, each of us in our distinct ways. Chunfang and you have been teaching history of mathematics together. I think this is the 3rd time that you've been doing that. And that means that actually, as a result of this, of your affiliation as adjunct professor, there are University of Southern Denmark students in mathematics that have also received teaching from you and are being taught with you. And knowing that your capacity and the long and the contributions that you have made to the field of mathematics and mathematics outreach, I think that is really a privilege and something that we are very grateful for. And Gitte and you have been in conversation over many years now about how you create networks that make a difference, that make change. And I know that every time you've had a conversation with Gitte, you're like, wow, that was really interesting.
Yeah, telling me.
So having a partner in conversation who explores what it is like to do innovation, what it is like to do collaborative activity, and to actually grow educational institutions, both from the bottom up and also from strategic direction, is one of the things that we have also felt it was very interesting to be in dialogue with you about. And want to mention one of the recent collaborations that you and I have been doing is actually we should direct our attention to Katrine, who's sitting over there, because Katrine and Dorte and Maiken and I and you have just published a paper in Education Sciences about mathematics and welding and how you can weld different kinds of classrooms together through mathematics. And the reason I'm highlighting you, Katrine, is because you were a lead actually on that paper. So thank you also for doing that. And thank you, Keith, for making your contribution to that paper. That paper has just been published. So again, one very tangible example of how we have worked together and the benefits for both of us, I think, in that. So we're very grateful to have you here, Keith. I have not done the long introduction of your CV. I know that everybody knows you, so I don't think that we need to do that as the farewell lecture part. But if any of you are curious to read more, I can tell you that Keith has a really nice Wikipedia online and has done multiple blog posts and other kinds of interactions. And maybe we should highlight the film that you participated in and that we did a viewing of last year when you were here. Can you help me remember what the name of that?
Counted Out.
Counted Out. So if you haven't watched the film called Counted Out, I really recommend that you look for it and see it. Keith has a role in the film. It is a film about the importance of mathematics in society and also about access to education. And we saw it at FNUG last year, I think it was. And many of us actually started crying when we saw it. So it's an emotional experience as well about the importance of education in general, and also specifically about access to mathematics. So now you're going to talk to us about the Devlin-Cardier-Goranson model from the National Security Agency to the hospital ward by way of the classroom. And you mentioned that consciousness is going to be
That's where we're going to end up.
Yeah, and I'm looking forward to that part particularly.
Okay.
But let's give Keith a hand to get started on.
Okay. So thank you. The talk is actually in two parts. The first part is a pre-recorded video because I want to do the background as quickly as possible, and the fastest way to get through a lot of material is just do a video in advance, edit it down the time, take all the little gaps out, and then just run the video, and it comes out at just over 15 minutes. And that establishes the background, and everything I'm going to be talking about on the video is published research. It's gone through peer review, it's stuff, it's just part of the science. Afterwards, when I go on to the keynote presentation, it gets wild. And it gets very wild because I said when we were putting this together, it's going to be like a small research seminar. It's just a matter of throwing ideas out. There are literally no experts in the world in the second half of this thing, and it's going to be a matter of talking about it. So we get some known stuff coming up first, and I'll just sit and watch it with the rest of you. And then I'll switch to a keynote presentation, which has some stuff on it that very rapidly leads us into some very deep waters. So with a bit of luck, this should work. My inaugural lecture began like this. When a lecture starts that way, you know in advance the answer's yes. And I tried to convince you of why it's so. I presented the theory, complete with a reference to a peer-reviewed publication. This is my topic for today. But this time, my answer will be mostly speculative. It is, as they say, a work in progress. I can start with a reason why I think it's worth pursuing. There are two promotional memes about mathematics that I pushed aggressively for back in the early 1990s onwards. I used the memes as the title of two books. I stole the first from at least two others. Google's AI says I originated the second, but I may have come across it somewhere. According to those memes, if you see a regular pattern in some object, situation, or event, it should be possible to apply mathematics, or at least mathematical thinking, which may or may not turn out to be sufficiently general to find other applications, and maybe even become a new technique or a new branch of mathematics. But in any case, you should be able to apply mathematics in that particular domain that you're looking at. That story had four parts. 1. This was the research that took me to Stanford. My interest in developing a theory of information began while I was an academic in the UK. There I was all alone, and thought by my colleagues to have destroyed a promising mathematical career by pursuing the question. But a small group of researchers concentrated around Stanford had been working on the question for several years, and they invited me to join them in 1987. In the 1990s, a brilliant Croatian social scientist called Duško Rosenberg, then at Brunel University in the UK, read some of my work and flew over to California to persuade me to work with her on a pile of real ethnographic data from her investigative work at a computer company. She was very persuasive, and we teamed up for what was for me the most significant project I ever engaged in. 3. Then there was a 12-year period where I took that work and applied it to US national security, working for the nation I became a citizen of in the millennium year. And finally 4. Working with two other researchers, we took the Devlin-Rosenberg work and, after some embellishments, applied it to a wide variety of domains. In my inaugural lecture, in 2023, I got in a Danish reference by using the Niels Bohr model of the atom as an excellent illustration of the way we were trying to get mathematics into the information picture. To make use of mathematics, you need a hugely simplistic way to picture the domain. It's that picture, mathematicians call it a mathematical model, on which you develop the mathematics. Another example is the electrical engineer's circuit diagram, or the biologist's picture of a molecule, or the Feynman diagram of particle interactions. None of these is accurate. They tell us virtually nothing about what's actually going on. Atoms don't look like that. In fact, we have no idea what they do look like, and very likely they don't look like anything in our conception. Electricity does not flow along wires, apart from what is called drift, at a velocity of less than an inch in a minute, and ditto all the other big mathematical models we have. This was the new model I presented here in 2023. It models cognitive activity, thought, communication, etc. as two interconnected systems. I'll explain what the parts represent by telling you how it was developed. As with the other examples, the model arose only after a lot of work. As presented here, the model incorporates input from two colleagues I worked with on my US Department of Defense work in the first decade of the new millennium. We first published the model in 2015. In 2017, we published a second paper with a number of co-authors where we applied it in a number of different domains. The presentation of the model you see here is due to Ted Goranson. With a background in big systems engineering and national security work, he presented it in a form that the Department of Defense would want if they, or we, were to build a tool for intelligence analysis. But where did it come from? What was the research it built on? This was the project I went to Stanford to work on. The overall goal was to develop tools that could be used to design and use the network of computers that everyone in the know knew was coming. I got drawn in with the release of the Macintosh computer in 1984, which I viewed as paper that is dynamic and has a memory. As a mathematician, paper was my medium, so this was potentially a big thing. That actually turned out to be the case, though not exactly in the way I imagined. The first question we had to answer is this: what is information? The newly created centre I was invited to Stanford to work in, the Centre for the Study of Language in Information, CSLI, was created to answer this and related questions. With a $23 million award from the Systems Development Foundation, it had scholars from around the world representing a wide range of disciplines. I was one of a very small number of mathematicians. After a lot of effort, here is the approach that turned out to be the most successful, at least from my perspective. Stanford hired philosopher Fred Dretske from Wisconsin, whose approach to information seemed the most promising from our perspective. He focused on the idea of classifying objects, situations, etc. by types. Both mathematicians and computer scientists reify types as mathematical objects. You can also define rational action in terms of types. Rational action depends on type recognition. For a given type of input stimulus, a rational agent produces a response of an appropriate type. We introduced reifiable entities called constraints as links between types. That leads to a mathematical abstraction capturing rational action. Constraints, e.g. behavioural norms or laws or whatever, connect types of input stimuli to types of responses. Expertise amounts to possession of a large range of domain types and constraints linking them to productive action types. By the way, there's a strong case to be made for regarding type creation and recognition as the primary function of the brain. That's actually how I approach the brain and cognition. Here's a simple example. If you, or a mammal, sees smoke on the horizon, and if you are aware of the constraint that says smoke is often a signal of fire, you can conclude that there's a fire and take appropriate evasive action. We can abstract that example instance to a general mathematical framework for studying information. In the diagram, C, and the arrow that goes from left to right, is the constraint that links the type of smoke to the type of fire. The colon notation means of the type, so little s colon big S means little s is of type big S. This is actually standard notation in many parts of mathematics and in computer science. This is a common mathematical structure called a commutative diagram, for which we have a lot of mathematical tools. You will find diagrams like the small image at the top right scattered through modern algebra textbooks. Notice, by the way, that I've drawn the bottom arrow right-left rather than left-right, because right-left is the direction that information flows. Notice that this diagram connects two different domains, the mind and the world. That's going to be important in what comes. You can find out more about all of this from a variety of books, one of which is a more popular account written by me for the airport business books market, called InfoSense. Part 2 of my information story was when I teamed up with Dushka Rosenberg. We used mathematics in a novel way, where the focus was on the process of analysing a domain using formal mathematics, not the analysis that you would get at the end. Blending that with the linguistic tools of conversation analysis and with ethnomethodology, we developed an analytic tool called LFZ analysis. That's the tool we use to identify the causes of miscommunication in the workplace, described in our book Language at Work. One particularly important instance of that work is the analysis of airline disasters, which often trace back to a miscommunication. Things developed further soon after the September 11, 2001 terrorist attack on New York City and Washington, D.C. First, I was invited to join a research project on improving intelligence analysis, funded by the National Security Agency, the NSA. After that, I did another multi-year project for the US Navy on analysing gigabytes of video surveillance recordings from drone flights. Then, finally, a small pilot project for the US Army on tools to support small special ops teams dropped into conflict cities. In all three cases, I was using the techniques I developed with Dushka Rosenberg. None of my research was classified, and I didn't receive security clearance. I was working at a very abstract general level that could be taken to the next step by others who did have such security clearance. Incidentally, the projects I was working on were all focused mainly on protecting lives, not destroying them. It was accepted that you had to go in and do things, and the goal of the projects was to make sure that as few casualties happened both to the troops that were sent in and any civilians in the conflict domain. It wasn't about developing weapons per se, it was trying to minimise injuries caused by the use of those methods. It was the Navy project that brought me together with Ted Goranson and Beth Cardier. I spent most of my time working on an analysis of the Christopher Nolan movie Memento. The goal was to predict likely endings based on the story up to a certain point. If you've seen the movie, you'll realise why that was a great test case. Again, I was using the techniques from Devlin and Rosenberg. Cardier, who is, among other things, an Australian fiction writer, used various versions of the children's fairy story Little Red Riding Hood as her test case. That too proved to be an ideal test case for the purposes at hand. Cardier knows her stuff. Goranson is a former MIT PhD student in AI, long before AI was a big thing, with many years of experience in Defence Department-funded research projects on big systems. He took my diagram of the mind-world systems and turned it into a form used by systems engineers. First, he labelled the two systems L1 and L2. Then he rotated the diagram 90 degrees counterclockwise to give the presentation we have been using since then. Goranson, with his background in systems engineering, is the one who put in the plumbing on the diagram, identifying the channels that carry the information to make the whole thing work. For the examples I had been looking at with Rosenberg, the types in L1 are types of things in the world, and the types in L2 are one level higher, types of types. This is where we get into human phenomenology. A famous recent illustration of how that can take you into L2 is the 2015 internet debate about the colour of a dress. The manufacturer said it was blue and black, but many people saw it as white and gold. The point is, colour is a complicated matter. What you see depends on how your brain interprets the background. If you see the dress as well lit, you will see it as blue and black. But if you see it as poorly lit, it will appear white and gold. To be honest, try as I may, I've never been able to see it as white and gold. For me, it's always blue and black. A similar example is the Adelson checkerboard. Squares A and B are exactly the same shade, but we don't perceive it that way, even if we know the answer. For our developmental case, Rosenberg and I took a classic example from the early ethnomethodology literature, first analysed by Harvey Sachs. The question is, how do we understand this simple two-sentence child's story? That analysis depended on the types connected with babies and mummies, both the types in the world and the types of those types. It was a phenomenological issue. The types we recognise and use in the world are often themselves subject to typing. This is how the model can be used to analyse phenomenological issues. But the model is way more versatile than that. In my 2023 lecture here in Odense, I presented the following examples. You can find all the details in the recording of that lecture. First, if we want to use it to understand the mind, we can think in the familiar terms of conscious brain versus subconscious. A second case is creative writing, where we focus on a much more narrow collection of notions. This is the path Cardier pursued in our second joint paper, the one with several other co-authors. Physician and medical researcher Larry Sanford applied it to PTSD. I also used the model to look at mathematical creativity, publishing my ideas in an essay in my monthly blog for the Mathematical Association of America in 2023. And there's a fairly obvious way to apply the model to education. That, briefly, was my 2023 inaugural lecture. Then stuff happened, as they say. In 2023, I mentioned that I'd use the model to track and do my best to assist my wife's recovery of her cognitive faculties after she had a major brain injury. In September 2020, she had outpatient surgery to insert an artificial toe joint. The surgery led to a bone infection, resulting in a seizure and the onset of a brain injury called PRES, posterior reversible encephalopathy syndrome. Think of it as a software stroke. All the parts of the brain are intact, but they've lost all the communication between them. They're all isolated. They do not cooperate together as they have to for the brain to work. It took 2.5 years for her to recover almost all of her mental cognitive faculties. That was a hard time for both of us. The Devlin-Cardier-Goranson model enabled me to make sense of every step of her recovery and help her. Though, to be honest, I didn't think of it that way. I was just thinking about what was happening to her and what I was learning about by talking with her in terms that helped me make sense. Since I'd spent many years developing that model, I was implicitly using the model. But to me, it was just doing what I felt I had to understand what was going on and to help her get better to the best of my ability. And it worked, not because it was a model that had been published, but because it was a model based on decades and decades of human study of the mind, communication, and human beings in general. All of that gets captured in that simple-looking diagram we produced. That's why the diagram works so well. And in the case of my wife, once she'd recovered speech, which took quite a while, we were able to talk at length about the phenomenology of each step. Okay, that was my inaugural lecture as quickly as I could summarise it. Now it's time to go live. And the one tricky thing is switching over to the keynote presentation. Okay. I've got to see the screen to do this. You may have to come and help me because you were able to do it and I couldn't see the screen. I'll let you do. We did several rehearsals. You make it look really easy. Much appreciated. Round of applause for that. That looked very tricky. Okay, so now we go live, and now things begin to get really weird. In fact, I very quickly will get into the domains that I vowed I would never get into the consciousness debate, because everybody has a different idea and it seems to go nowhere. At CSLI, there was a consciousness research group back when I was there in the 80s. In fact, David Chalmers was one of the big people, the one who called it the so-called hard problem of consciousness. He was there at some times. They were talking about it. It was a group of philosophers, and I occasionally sat in on it, and I thought, I haven't got the patience for this. It's just going round and round and round. But as you'll see, if you're a mathematician that follows patterns, you can't help but end up asking about consciousness. That's just where I ended up. Okay, I will mention that episode with my wife, there'll probably be a book. I had volumes of data I collected because I was collecting all the data because I knew I had to talk to the medics about what was going on and so forth. So I recorded everything like a laboratory scientist would, although I've never been a laboratory scientist. So I have masses of data. Several times I tried to write the book, but it was too recent. It was too traumatic, so I had to give up and come back to it. But it is slowly coming forwards. So there'll probably be a book about that. One of the interesting things is Beth Cardier, at about the same time my wife got Prez, was hit by a car in, I think, New York City or somewhere around there, and suffered major concussion. She had major brain injury, and it took her a long time, like years, to recover her faculties. So she also went through the same process, and her husband, he's now her husband, Ted Goranson, was in the same position that I was in with my wife. So we've got two people from this team involved in relatives issues for which this thing was relevant. So that was really kind of weird. So there'll probably be a book, and I've talked with Ted about his wife, Beth. I know her as well. She had many of the same problems my wife did. Both of them were creative writers, and neither of them, after the injury, could write more than a paragraph. They couldn't string things together. My wife finally recovered that within the last year, and I haven't heard about Beth recently. Okay, so that's going to be coming up, I thought. But for the second part, there was actually an alternative title that I would have liked to have used, because this is really what you've seen. That video is about my adventures as a mathematician, following the interesting questions, going from place to place, different partners, doing different things. And it was all about looking at the patterns, formalizing them, studying them, and doing something with them. So that was basically my career. And it looks sort of random from the outside, unless you realize what I was looking for. And it was those underlining patterns. But I couldn't really use that because it's already been used. A very famous mathematician called Stan Ulam. I actually occupied his office in Boulder, Colorado once when I was over there teaching back in the 70s. He was off in Los Alamos, where he spent a lot of time for reasons you'll see in a minute. And so I had his office, and I knew I was going to get his office. I thought, I'll be able to, he's a very famous guy. I thought, oh, I'll get a sense of Stan Ulam. I'll be in his office. It was completely bare except for a large calculus textbook on the desk. He obviously would go in, get the calculus textbook, give a class, and then walk out again. Because he was a distinguished professor. He had all sorts of honorary positions across the United States. Polish-American mathematician. Whoops, what happened to that? Oh. Okay, I'll just run it forward quickly. Okay, so he published a book called Adventures of a Mathematician in 1976. That was his sort of autobiography. That particular edition is 1991 with that image on it. And the title is also the title of a movie. Well, this tells you what he did. He was one of the two people that invented the hydrogen bomb, along with Edward Teller. Edward Teller did the physics. Stan Ulam did the mathematics. Interestingly, Stan Ulam was a pure mathematician. He worked in infinite cardinalities. He worked in finite and infinite combinatorics, graph theory, discrete mathematics. Games, basically, mathematical games. Well, it turned out one of the secrets to building an H-bomb is a mathematical game. If you place a large number of atomic bombs, fission bombs, in a circle around some hydrogen and blow them all up at the same time, that atomic implosion, if you do it right, if you position them correctly, it homes in on the hydrogen at the right moment, and you get fusion and a very big bang. And that was just a combinatorial problem. How do you place things on a sphere in order that their shock waves converge on a circle, perfect circle in the middle? He was following the patterns. And it sort of resonated with me because my work for the Defense Department also came from my following patterns, work with the Rosenberg about patterns of communication. I had no idea I was going to end up working for those guys. And like most people who do that, I went through all sorts of anguish, and I sort of alluded to that in the video. Because mathematicians keep getting asked to join these projects. In my case, it was right after September the 11th. I'd just become a citizen, and I got this call, will you help? And I thought about it a while. I thought, I'm a mathematician, so I have already been working on weapons of war. If you're in mathematics, you are building one of the most powerful cognitive technologies the world has ever had. It's so powerful, it can be used for enormous good and for enormous evil. If you don't want to build weapons, you do not become a mathematician, period. You simply can't sit on the fence. Sitting on the fence is a decision, and it has consequences. So this is why all these mathematicians in the Manhattan Project ended up anguishing about what you do next. Who said that? Any idea who said this? That today's warfare is a war of mathematicians. You could have said it in the Second World War with the code breaking and so forth, but this is actually talking about weapons themselves, the actual weapons, as Archimedes built with those mirrors to burn the ships, right? So this has got a long history, mathematicians on warfare. That quote comes from someone who I guess has learned the consequences of not having the best mathematicians working on the tools. That was Putin 2 years ago. Because the Ukrainians kicked their ass by doing better mathematics and using different tools. Absolutely right. If you're in mathematics, you're in this game. You cannot do it. Okay, so I anguished, but in the end, I made what I thought was the decision for me. But to get back to the main theme, these are examples. The general theme is you have a simplistic diagram. If it's a good diagram, then the mathematics you develop can be useful. So what in particular is it that makes it a good diagram? Well, they certainly have to be simple. The simpler, the better. You have to capture the critical elements. So you've got to know what those elements are. There's a lot of parameters. You have to go for a few of them. That's why it takes a long time to get a model that really works. And the connections between them that are relevant to the purpose. So those are the criteria for this simplistic picture. It looks easier once you've got one. But think of all the models they had for the atom in the early days. The Niels Bohr one, which didn't last more than 6 months because it was quickly overturned, became the one that everyone thinks of because it turned out to be the one that was optimal for the human mind to think about. It was just the right level of complexity. So today, that's still the symbol of the Atomic Energy Authority. It's still the basic model for teaching students about the atom. So it was a great model, but everyone knew from almost the beginning that it was false as a description. And they know that. The whole point, it's not accurate, it's trying to describe something. In fact, they are almost always inevitably inaccurate. But what they do is provide a way to think about an object or a process. So it's not a question of is it realistic, in the way they represent reality. Is it helpful? Does it help people tell a story about the world that we can do something with, and in particular, develop mathematics to do something? So this is the model I was talking about. And I'll give you a little bit of the history. There's a lot of history we're drawing upon from social sciences, bits of computer science and mathematics and bits of algebra. So we pulled in a lot of stuff, and we ended up with this particular model for that particular domain. And the obvious way of interpreting it is the one, and this is the one I used with my wife, was the real world mind and the internal world mind. Conscious and unconscious is a more familiar difference. And this is just repeating something that was in the video. There's one way of using this particular model. In the literature, the bit on the left is sometimes referred to as the default network or the default node network. So different sciences and disciplines have taken similar ideas. This particular diagram, as I indicated, was based on conversation analysis and big systems design. And that combination led to this particular one. So it was optimized from the perspective of several disciplines. And then when I started thinking about it, about the time I was working with my wife after prayers, I was beginning to think about the dialogue between the conscious part, the part we're aware of, the linear part, and the massively parallel stuff on the left. Which of course puts me in the realm of people who looked at inner speech. Except this is inner speech with a structure, with a geography. It makes a difference whether you're L1 talking to L2 or L2 talking to L1, because L1 is very linear and is linked to the world. L2 is very parallel, probably quantum, and is linked to, well, what it's linked to is what's going to come later when it gets wild. Because once you go on this, you've got to ask what things are linked to, because this leads you down a certain path. Not necessarily the right path, it's a useful path, and it's an intriguing path. Okay. So when you do it, this is how I did it with this model. I'm thinking, well, L2 is you. That's basically you. It's everything, all including the subconscious stuff, whatever. It's a massively parallel thing. Geographically, L1's a little part of that. By the way, these are functional distinctions. It's all in the head. It's just stuff going on. Well, maybe it's all in the head. That's where it gets interesting. But initially, I thought it's all in the head, and so these are just functional distinctions that are very useful for doing research. L2 carries your history. It's there. It lived it. So in a sense, it's got it. It almost certainly records everything. The perfect remember thing. Your cloud is in your head in that sense. And L1 is just the intelligent interface to the world, and it's linear and much slower, and serves that purpose of being the interface. L1 is the thing we're sort of aware of, we can talk about. I'm using it now and you're listening to it. That's where we experience our sense of existence. That's where we feel things, because we've got no access to L2. But what it is we're thinking is actually going on in L2. Okay. So this is an unequal distinction, and this is why this structure influences all the conversations you might have about this. It influenced the way I looked at my wife. It influenced the way Ted looked at his wife, because you've got this very two different things. You've got a massively parallel thing, and you've got a linear thing, and that really adds structure to the analysis you're doing. So it's not just talking about an internal conversation. It's an internal conversation between two very unequal and very different creatures. L2 knows about it because that's everything in a sense. L1 is just a special little part of it. And so we can't in general search L2. L2 knows what's going on in L1. So if you want something to happen in L2, you've got to nudge it. And the mathematician's way is think about a problem for 3 months. After 3 months of thought of the problem, L2 has sort of got the message and starts running massively parallel simulations. And one day when you're sitting in the bath, you think, oh, I've got the answer. That's how that method works. But you have to do the 3 months of thinking to get the message across to L2. L2 doesn't care unless you've really bored it to tears about thinking about that damn stupid problem about graphs, right? That's how it sort of works. but you can't search because it's this other thing you've got to wait. We do develop filters because 3 months of thinking about a problem, you get all sorts of ideas. And when L2 finally generates billions of possibilities, you've got filters that will filter it down to maybe a dozen or so that look plausible. And then you sort of look at the best of them and you, with a bit of luck, you get a solution. So there's a mechanism for creative thinking. Okay. So there is a slight way past that. If what we want is a bunch of possibilities, we have a way of getting them if we persist. And I've used this a lot. I use it with my wife. I use it to try and get a sense of what's going on in that dark space that I call L2. And again, that's just a functional distinction. Just one little interesting example in terms of the diagram, because on the flight over from London to Copenhagen about a month ago on British Airways, all you get is a bottle of water. And this was put on in front of me in the seat. My wife was sitting next to me. And I turned and said, should I call the attendant and ask her to replace this with a bottle of spring water? Because I don't want a bottle of recycled plastic. It was a silly joke and I couldn't help myself. But then I thought, I shall take a photo and I shall use it in this talk, because this is a classic example of where that diagram makes a distinction between things. You've got a couple of types. You've got the type of being a bottle, and you have an object which is of that type. That is an object of type bottle. Go over to the other side, types of types. You've got two other kinds of types. Bottle as a type can be a type of container, and bottle as a type can be a type of manufactured artifact. The person who wrote that was thinking of a manufactured archetype. Any person on the plane, any consumer, thinks of a bottle as a container. So this is the kind of screw up that can cause airplanes to crash, because you use the language and the language has two very different meanings. It caused all sorts of problems in the workplace. Almost certainly, assuming the NSA did something with the work I did with them for many years, that was where they used it to make those second or third, you can iterate it to higher distinctions, to parse apart the different meanings. I doubt if they're still doing this, because large language models can do this much faster these days. But back in the days we were doing it in the 90s, this I'm sure, the early 2000 era, my guess is that was what the NSA was looking for, a way of parsing things out in order to make their systems work better. Okay, moving on from that. That was a topic of phenomenology from my wife or whatever, where you just go along and you look at higher orders of typing. Now I want to go back and compare this model, the Devlin-Cardier-Goranson model, and compare it with the model of electricity, because it was thinking about this one. And I talked about this one without really planning it in advance at the inaugural lecture. And after the inaugural lecture, I thought, I've said some things today that I really should think a bit more about. And I did think a bit more about them, and it led me down this path, which ultimately will get me to what the hell consciousness is. Okay, so you can ask yourself, what is that? Well, there's an answer we can give, because there's a thing called Maxwell's equations, which back in the late 19th century sort of tells us everything we want to know. It says how electricity and magnetism, these fields and interact. There's the electric current. It's in the equation. Yes, that's the electric current that's going through the wires. Well, that was what they thought. Actually not going through the wires, but that's another issue we'll come to in a minute. What Maxwell's equations do, it tells us what an electric current is. It's a vector in a field. Most people in the world don't know what you're talking about at that point. Mathematicians do, but they think, oh, it's an abstract realm. Oh, that's good. I know that's got axioms, it's got rules. I can work with it. And then the next matter is what? We're playing games with words here. An electromagnetic field is a manifestation of a force, and the force is the electromagnetic field. We're introducing words that depend on each other and that sort of carry a meaning, but not very much. It's not as rigid as saying it's a vector in a field. That's precisely defined. but it's not the answer people are hoping you're going to give them. A little bit more detail. There's a whole bunch of parameters that you need to specify. You write down the equations. Whoops. Oh, I know what I'm doing when I'm hitting the wrong button on this thing. Okay. The whole thing gets developed. I mean, this is sort of a subsequent development after Maxwell wrote it. He ended up redoing it in a book, and you get these much more complete descriptions of the things. But it came from, laboratory experiments, observations about magnets and electricity in the laboratory and so forth. And it's brilliant to be able. It's a brilliant step to be able to come up with equations that sort of describe the thing precisely. There's the one that actually mentions the electric current. So this looks impressive. It's hard to dismiss something that got that kind of mathematics behind it. Electricity is useful. You can sell it. It can cost a fortune. We try to find cheaper ways to produce it. So it's something we can buy and sell. We make use of it. And it's got some mathematics behind it. You can't really dismiss it. You can't say there is no such thing. And yet, what we've got here is a mathematical model. It's a story that people tell about the world. It's a mathematical model. But given that there's the mathematics and the engineering that you can do, why do we still tell ourselves? Why do we still tell that story? Well, my brother-in-law is an electrical designer. He designs some of the equipment at Heathrow that carries your baggages around, and the escalators and that kind of thing. So if the escalator stops at Heathrow, it could have been something my brother worked on. It might not have been, but it could have been. He does that kind of thing. His world depends on thinking of electricity that way. Any electrical engineer does. Unless you're working on the national grid. People working on the national grid don't think of it this way. It's a very different animal. But people who build things think of it that way. People who design microchips think of it this way. We know it's not true. We know what is actually going on in the sense of using these mathematical terms. So why do we do that? Well, two very practical reasons. That's very useful. That's a way to think about it if you want to build stuff, including generators, big generators, microchips, whatever. Think of it that way. The guys that design they work on the length of the channel because they want to make it as short as possible because of the speed of light, supercomputers. It was all about optimizing lengths of wires. So it involved very precise application of the idea that electricity was traveling through a wire. And there's some solid maths behind it. So everyone knew that they were playing this game, but it works. And so it's accepted. But hang on. This story still depends upon these things that we haven't really defined, except within the mathematics. Force, field, those are mathematicians' words or engineers' words. Physicists use the word in a slightly different way. I mean, mathematicians decided years ago that it was pointless asking the question, what is this thing? They couldn't even say, until the end of the 19th century, they didn't have a good answer to the question, what is a number? They simply didn't. I mean, Newton, who invented calculus based on numbers, knew full well that he didn't have a notion of number that he was using. They just pretended they knew what they were doing. And it was only at the beginning of the 20th century that mathematicians said, to hell with it. We're not going to answer any of the what is it questions. We're going to say, what properties do they have? We'll treat mathematics as a game. It's a game that has rules like chess or something else, pieces, rules. Learn the rules, learn what the positions can do, and play the game, and then apply it to the world. So you play an abstract game and apply it to the world. And it's incredibly powerful, incredibly powerful. Okay, and it will build you an atomic bomb, and it did. And when it did, Einstein is reported to have said, "Ist das wirklich so?" Now, did it really work? It wasn't really the case. Because they were just writing equations that involved exponential growth. Okay, so there's utility, right? But let's remember how we got there. The people designing circuits, they were putting things together. They had that picture in their mind. They were plumbing. They weren't plumbing with liquids. They were plumbing with these things called electrons. Actually, they thought in terms of electrons. That was the thought process. What they were actually doing, because the universe was playing a trick on them, everything they did, they saw, oh, this works. So it must work to put these wires together that way. This works. And the model they had in their mind was, those were the conduits. That wasn't what the universe was doing. The universe was doing something else. That artifact changed the world around it. Just like if you put a pebble down, it changes the gravitational field around it. Space-time changes when you put a pebble there. So things in the universe have a habit of changing the universe. These devices, as they got more and more complicated, made the universe change in different ways. They had to be built out of certain materials. They had to be done in a different way. And subsequently we've learned to do it with light and other things. But what it was doing was modifying the field. So the feedback they were getting was misleading but useful. So this was great engineering. It's terrible science. Gosh, if science is telling you what's actually going on, it wasn't doing that. And now we know that. If that happened with something like electricity, what's going to happen with the model we've got, the cognitive model that's dealing with the brain? Well, whatever's going on with the brain, we'd better remember that story, because it's going to be easy to get misled. And we ought to, this time, fool me once, shame on me. No, fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. If we know what happened with the electricity story, we'd better be careful if we're developing a new model. So here we go. This repeats what I've said before. That thing was stuck in there. And I had that stuck in there 3 years ago. And afterwards I thought, I'm not sure what that means here. What is it? It's just like asking the question what electricity is. By then I thought, well, it might not be what I'm thinking it is. Okay, so we've got this picture, and somewhere over there's this stuff called consciousness. I didn't want to go there. There was nowhere left to go. Well, what you can do, of course, is just apply Occam's razor and say, okay, we know what's happened with electricity. It's a simple assumption, just assume it's a field. And if you're a mathematician, that's a really nice way out of the problem, because it worked before. Just call it a field, do some mathematics, and deal with it. What you've got now is panpsychism, which, funnily enough, has appealed to mathematicians for the beginning of time. Thales, the guy who gave us proofs, the guy who gave us geometry, they ended up with this kind of idea of panpsychism. Leibniz did, and more recent people. Bertrand Russell did, Whitehead and Russell. They end up with thinking of consciousness as a field, because it's a get out of jail free card for mathematicians. It allows you to do some mathematics, and we feel comfortable with it. But it may not appeal to everybody, and it doesn't. Well, according to the picture I was working with, consciousness is located over here. It's massively parallel, probably involving quantum phenomena, but not necessarily so. Though if you say that in public, the quantum theorists will go for you. And it's experienced there because that's the sort of thing that's our awareness, that's the conscious mind. And we have this sense that sort of comes from there. So the diagram can accommodate this. Okay, and I've been thinking about it this way along. But I got to be a bit worried about that. Because if consciousness is a field in the universe, in what sense is it mine? I don't talk about my electromagnetic field. I say I'm in an electromagnetic field. I don't talk about my gravity. I've got a gravitational attraction on the universe. So, a bit worrying, to say the least. So consciousness is sort of out there. And as I said, this is why it gets wild. And it's all speculative. That's an obvious way out, to say, okay, well, my L2 is connected to the universe. That's like sort of the cloud, the human cloud. And that may be a good way to picture it, but it's a bit too fanciful. So let's turn it into something that looks a bit more mathematical. Let's say there's another realm here called the universe. And we're sitting in it, and we've got these systems. So it's just use the same idea, go one step higher, and now that we're now talking to this universal field. But there's two possibilities, well, at least two. One is that your mind, your L2, the stuff that's literally going on in the circuits in your mind, in your brain, it's maybe communicating all the time with the universe. The other way to think about it, which is really scary, is it's actually not in your head at all. It is the whole effing universe. And you'll just have a sensation of it here. You know, people use different metaphors. One is that the consciousness is like a radio signal that's everywhere, and you're a receiver, and that you can pick it up in certain points, and you can pick it up. But what you're picking up, although it's in the receiver and you can understand it in there, that's where you hear it, it's actually a signal that's everywhere. And there are other metaphors that people use. I've sort of, interestingly, the stuff on consciousness, it's mostly a debate carried out on YouTube. There's hundreds of YouTube videos where people argue about this. But there's two different ways of thinking about it. My inclination is to keep going with what I've got, which is this diagram, because that's been my baby. I want to stick with that thing. It's a mathematical model. That is still a mathematical model. So I'm still feeling comfortable to some extent. The next step would be to model it and build it out a bit. It's pretty crude. It needs building out in the light of these other discussions. So I've been looking at all these debates on consciousness, thinking, how do I take account of that in this model? I'm looking for ways to apply my model because it's a mathematician's model. So the first thing is to say, don't think about this as a decision. That's a hypothesis. Simply accept the sort of panpsychism thing that says organisms that exhibit consciousness, whatever that is, we haven't defined it yet, developed to exploit a fundamental first. Just as we built devices that exploit the electromagnetic field. Maybe nature created a device that exploited the consciousness field. It had a lot more time on its hands than we did, so it had the time to do it. And we managed to do electricity in about 40 years. It might be that we need to find another model, I admit that. But I'm not the guy to do that. I've got my model, I'm working with that one, and I'll see how far it takes me. So based on that model, let's observe that it might take some time to start encompassing consciousness, because look at the example for electricity. 1835 was the first time someone invented a light bulb. Didn't work very well, but they got one to show light. 26 years later, Maxwell first established his equations in the first form. Took another 4 years before he sort of finalized the whole thing and made it look sort of like the thing I showed earlier. That's a much more modern one still, but it took another 4 years of work to get the thing sort of right and to produce a book. And it was another 14 years before Edison developed the first practical light bulb. So knowing the mathematics doesn't seem to help you an awful lot. It's certainly useful to have it, but that took a while. People have only been talking about consciousness seriously for the last 25, 30 years. Chalmers, I think, introduced the term the hard problem in 1995 or something like that. So the hard problem being, what's it feel like to be a person? And if you go on these YouTube videos, it's all over the place. People have all sorts of decisions. As I said, I'm still going with my diagram. I want to see how far I'll get with that diagram. However, I think we're definitely at this stage. If you believe that there is something called electricity, you've got no logical ground to believe that the universe isn't conscious. You can't. You can't hold the two things away, not if you're a rational person. However, if you want to go around saying consciousness, you're likely to get shot down, and a good retort to being shot down goes back to Bertrand Russell. You face that person who's become angry at your suggestion, and then said, if your opinion is making you angry, that is a sign that you are subconsciously aware of having no good reason for thinking as you do. If you have to resort to anger, you haven't got logic. Kind of interesting. So when you see people arguing based on emotions, That's not what science is about. It's about accepting the possibilities. The trouble is it gets very wild. So one last look at this. That gave us, and in fact, generally, mathematics gives us an accurate representation of our best understanding of a phenomenon. It is a model. Could be useful, but it's always a model. Gives us a story. It tells our story in ways we can understand, especially if we can understand the mathematics. But the world may be doing things very differently. It might be like electricity. It's not doing what we thought it was doing. It may be doing things we can never compensate. And if that's the case with electricity, it sure is going to be the thing with consciousness, I would think. We know if we put any object down, it modifies the local gravitational field. In particular, it's true for an electrical device. Electrical devices do something else as well. They modify the local electromagnetic field. Maybe a pebble does. Maybe it's very minor, but maybe a very small pebble does something very slight to the electromagnetic field. How could we know? Doesn't look very interesting, but whatever. In the case of electricity, that diagram does give us a map to understand what it's doing. So that diagram is useful because it gives us some sense of that, and it's a map that you can literally follow if you want to build a device. Be that a small microchip. I mean, those diagrams are very effective in understanding to some extent what the modification to the field is. But, and I'm just going to end with a bunch of questions. What happens to the consciousness field if you put a stone down on the ground? Assuming there's a consciousness field, and now we're asking the phenomenology of that. What happens to the field? We know we know that the gravitational field changes. We know that the magnetic field, well, we don't know that, but it might well do. We really don't know. Actually, it probably does, because there's probably tiny bits of metal in the pebble anyway, so it probably does have some effect. But what about you do this kind of thing? As most of us, anyone here knows, it's hard to watch that and not think there's some sort of sentience going on. It's really sort of a little bit disturbing. Yes, we know there's the transformation's been done, but it's kind of disconcerting because we're at the fairly basic level of life here, relatively basic, and yet it's exhibiting things that get into our psyche. What if you plant a bean on the ground? There have been studies where they plant beans in a laboratory and the bean starts to grow its roots. And when it gets down to a certain level, if there's water somewhere, the roots will move towards the water. So what they do in the laboratory is they put water on one side, not another one. And the bean sprout will start to go towards the water. Gets wild when they don't put in the water, but they put an audio signal of water running down along a channel. The bean root will go towards the noise. Does the bean hear the noise? In some sense, it does. So there's weird things. What if you do this one? You can have a post about 30 centimeters away from a bean, and the tendrils that need to go out to wrap it around the post so it can grow, they will make their way towards the pole. They know where the pole is. They can detect the pole and move towards it. Gets problematic to eat beans if you're not careful. Right? What about when you plant a tree in a forest? The other trees will do one of two things. They'll either help support it or they'll kill the thing off by putting various chemicals to it. So they can defend themselves or they can be welcoming it to an incomer. You know, they can be pro-immigration and anti-immigration. You can get that in the forest. So there's all sorts of behaviors going on with trees. What about put a worm down? It's hard to imagine the worm doesn't have a sense of feeling and following things. If you look at its behavior, there seems to be a sentience there. There's not a brain as such, not in the sense we mean, but it can move in different directions. These things can move towards food, away from danger. They are rational actors. They will protect themselves by moving in the right direction. And to go for a famous example, what's it like to be a bat? This is what Thomas Nagel, back in 70s, I think, philosopher, said, what's it like to be a bat? A creature that doesn't have vision, but encounters the world through sound. What's it like to be the bat? There's no way we can answer that. We might be able to sell a story of what we think it would be like to be a bat, but we've no way of knowing what the bat actually thinks. What goes on? We're talking about the consciousness field. You put a laptop down. What's that? What's the field around that laptop like? Does it bear any relationship to the circuitry in there, or just its weight, or whatever? Because we're talking about levels of thought, and when do we want to call them consciousness? What happens when a neuroscientist sits down at their desk and starts thinking and doing neuroscience? What happens to the field? Assuming there's a field. And if that neuroscientist shows us one of these great videos they make with good graphics and diagrams of quantum phenomena and microtubules and all sorts of things going on, how does that relate to the consciousness? Assuming there's a consciousness field, that's the assumption. Remember, that's everything's based on the assumption that consciousness is a field. What goes on to that field when all of that's done, and how does it correspond to her explanation in terms of neuroscience? In fact, how will you ever know? I mean, could you even never know? I mean, are these questions we can answer? I mean, I guess my feeds on the web are telling me that string theorists are beginning to retreat, and that they think string theory isn't the way to go. I'm not sure whether that's how common that is, but I've picked up on that just by reading stuff. So they may be backing off, and it may well be that they'll back off from the idea that consciousness is in the microtubules and the sort of Penrose stuff. I mean, that's all going on. But these are all questions that relate to the fundamental notion of consciousness. I've got no idea. I've got a diagram that I think might help, and I'm pursuing that diagram because that's the only, if you've got a horse, that's your mode of transportation. You do what you can do on a horse. And I'm too old to come up with another one, so I'm going to follow that one. It's a hell of a question. And we can at least start to answer it with a framework. I mean, there's one framework. It gives you a geography that may or may not help. That diagram, the model, the Devlin-Cardier-Gorsanson, that diagram is based on a lot of work in cognitive science. So it's got a lot going for it to work in this domain. But I have no idea. Anyway, so this is a farewell lecture. It's been a blast. And coming here each year has not only provided me all sorts of community, but given what's going on back at the other side of the pond, it was kind of, although I gather you don't actually have a government at the moment, but never mind.
Well, we're getting there.
So, you do now? No, it's okay. Well, yeah. So there's little ripples, Maybe that's the pebble compared with the United States block of heavy rock, but still a pebble. Okay. Okay, so that's been kind of nice. So I want to end with that. Thank you to everyone for having me here. And I think we've got time to chat and then have some fun.
Wonderful.
So we can.
Thank you, Keith. I'm actually going to, I'd like to ask a question, and maybe more people have questions as well. So I'm going to say that you have become a biologist, right? I mean, that's basically what you're arguing for, is that we need to take into consideration that organism plus environment actually develop together.
Yeah.
And so maybe instead of mathematics, maybe you should actually be pursuing it via biology. What do you say to that?
I'm too old to do it, but I would think it's a good idea for people to do.
Yeah.
Absolutely do it, and team up with mathematicians as well. But mathematics is successful, became successful by removing itself from the world and saying we'll deal with the abstractions. And that's very powerful, and it's very seductive. But, at the end of the day, you've just got a model, and somehow you've got to plug it into the world.
Right.
If you're talking about consciousness and qualia and all that, you've got to read a lot more philosophy, that's for sure.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, I kind of playfully made an alternative question for you. asking what can we tune into with science and what kind of mathematics is relevant in that kind of science. Because some of the things that you are approaching now, where you're externalizing emotions, you're externalizing body, basically in your model, is some of the aspects that are included in some of the other sciences, right? I mean, there's such a connection between what you're talking about and aspects like embodied cognition and enacted cognition and things like that. So it's fascinating. Too.
From my perspective, it comes back to the follow the patterns. You look for the simplistic patterns and see how far you can take it. And so if it's biology or if it's psychiatry or whatever, you carve off a little bit that you can do. I did it with my wife and it turned out to be brilliantly effective. Her recovery modeled everything we knew about machine learning. It was literally, the brain was machine learning. It was acting like a network. Literally, it was a network connecting its flaws. That model is almost certainly false, but it's a very useful way of thinking. And it worked for her. With her. It would work with cardio. So you can make predictions, you can say when things happen, and you can understand when things are likely to go wrong. And that kept happening all the time. I was often a step ahead of the doctors because I was thinking of it from detailed phenomenology and saying, this surely will happen next. And it did. There was one occasion where she hadn't got vision. And she just saw F scenes. And we were driving the car down the driveway one day and I said, look, there's a blackberry out. I forget one of the bushes we've got in the field. I said, there's a blackberry come out. She said, I don't see the blackberry. What? And I said, pointed very close, leant over, there's a blackberry there. Don't see it. Then she said, oh, I can see the blackberry. Then instantly she said, it's all blackberries. Once she got one, and that didn't surprise me because I knew it was a matter of just pairing the eyes together and getting depth vision.
And some of what I find to provide a build onto the analysis that you're doing, you are also telling about a cognitive system that is actually enforced by your presence in your wife's life. So actually the cognitive system becomes more than one human being. It becomes a body with another body in a car, in an environment. So actually maybe expanding the scope of what you consider in the analysis, that's what I feel that you with your story are demonstrating. You're demonstrating how the cognition is actually something that is enacted in a community.
I'm no longer doing the abstraction kind of mathematics. I'm not looking for axioms.
No.
I'm trying to use a way of thinking to tease apart what I'm seeing in the world. And that's the only thing I bring in of value is a long career of looking for patterns in a certain way. And it's limiting and freeing. If you do that, there's probably not a huge number of people who look at it that way. So you can make some contribution. But it's by no means the only way. There's lots of different ways. Which is why, it always now comes back to very interdisciplinary research. Because I say when I went to CSLI, they very wisely said, we don't need many mathematicians, 5 or 6 of them. That's all they needed. They had an awful lot of philosophers, a lot of linguists, practical linguists, sociolinguists, formal linguists. I mean, a whole bunch of those people. People on the fringes of AI that were thinking about cognition and cognitive science. But very few mathematicians. And that was a reason. I think that was about the right decision. I think the only one who stuck with it and changed to what was being used, what was useful there. Most of the other, including Bauwise, who was one of the co-founders of CSLI, he eventually bailed out and went back to doing standard mathematics because that was how he got his kicks. I found I was getting my kicks by going at the problem itself.
And working with in interdisciplinary collaboration.
You can't write so many papers. You can write position papers, you can write blogs and that kind of thing, or you can do YouTube channels. But even at CSLI, we had a problem with publications because it was very interdisciplinary. We created our own publishing house, CSLI Publications, Cambridge University Press sort of handled it for us, but we did all the publication decisions. And we relied upon that community to peer review everything and justify it. It was a small internal group. There was no other way to do it.
So I'm going to Yeah, Mike, and you have
Thank you so much. It's always a pleasure to, talk to you and hear many of your insights. So I'm just thinking along with you, like if consciousness is a field, right?
Yeah.
This is also something that I've been working with from a post-humanistic perspective, meaning also the quantum mechanics part of it, as you were referring to. So I want to play along with you in the what if consciousness is a field, right? And you had a lot of thinking, and you also said that you don't have the answer, so I'm just playing along with you like we do. But you were pointing to many things, like you were also saying, Connie, like mind plus environment equal consciousness, right? And consciousness certainly becomes something that's also linked with or enacted with your body, with your senses and so on. But and you touched a bit upon it on the last question, like what if consciousness is a field, what about the abstract bodily or the abstract concepts, like your model itself, right? So the model itself also enacted the way that you shaped your consciousness in the example that you referred to with Jen, right?
Oh yeah, you see, it completely shapes me. I'm locked into it.
Yeah, and I was really like thinking, so what happens if we see consciousness in that way? What happens to the way that we see the world as something that enacts consciousness also, but also what happens to the mathematics itself, right? It's really like, could we then really see it as this stable structure kind of?
Interesting question. I mean, there's certainly an increasing number of people who are just questioning the entire materialist approach. That materialism has run its course, and that massive AI is probably going to be society's break point, and think that's just not the way life can go. It was worked well for several centuries. I think it's all materialistic, mechanical models of the universe, and it was very effective. And I grew up in it. I mean, I've been struggling to leave that. I just think, what do I do? I mean, so every time something weird happened with my wife, I could think of 3 or 4 logical, classical explanations of what was going on. But then I had this sense, that's not what's going on. I mean, we got married, I was 19, so we're coming up for our 60th anniversary. So we are very closely bounded. And so we have a really good, we do things at the same time. All the time, we order the same meals. It's just, and you can argue that rationally, but there's a lot of qualia going. There's a lot of stuff going on there that's beyond that, and we both sense it's beyond that. And even though I can parrot this and think, oh, you're anxious about that, so of course you're creating that story for yourself. It's how you deal with death. You deal with all kinds of things. Actually, that doesn't satisfy me. I'm now at the stage of looking for other answers. Maybe it's just because I'm old. But there's a limit to how far you can get with that approach. And it doesn't mean to say there's nothing else. We just haven't figured it out yet. And you can take the idea of looking for patterns, but you get to choose what you mean by a pattern. And so maybe when we can be better attuned to how we can come in and do it. And it, doesn't have to include calculus. Doesn't have to include anything particular.
Just a small anecdote in a way, I guess, and then Gita has a question as well. A scientific finding that I found interesting recently was that they have been able to make measurements now where they see that the 2 people who are working together and who have sympathy for each other, their heart rate will adjust, so it'll coordinate. And I think I really love that finding because it sort of really manifests this field that you were talking about, right? I mean, you could see it as that at least. So that's the kind of science I would like to see more of, is the kind of science that actually really tries to discover and to describe the relations between people and other species as well, actually.
I mean, I think there's a reason why YouTube is one of the main channels, because it brings in more human communication abilities when you see
Yeah.
people discussing things,
True.
because they can refer to things that just, if you try to write it precisely, it falls away.
Yeah.
And you can carry the intonations, which carry a lot of information.
Good.
Yeah.
Okay, I think we're going to have
Yes,
Gitte
yeah.
and then Jesper as with two more questions, and then I think we'll round off. Yeah.
And I would also very much like to play along and go into, because I do not know a lot about consciousness. But I would like to go into this, what if cognition is a system, or what is then cognition? And from phenomenologically, we know of the logics of deduction, you know, where we have certainty from rules, right? And we know induction, where we generalize from examples. And then we have, and I think maybe I actually asked you one time before about abduction, which is this hunch. We just know it. We just grab onto it, and it's there. That if we want to explain consciousness, which type of logics, or could we maybe get help from the different types of logic that, for example, Charles Sanders Peirce many years ago explained through semiotics? Is that the way to go, or is it actually something more like on the systems level? Yeah.
One thing I've been playing with is trying to find ways to actually communicate with my own L2. Now that may just mean the universe, but actually find ways to communicate it.
From L1 to L2.
Yeah, and actually could, and I've had some successes, but it's kind of wild. What I had to learn how to do was set up a bunch of alternatives, and I'd sometimes just write a whole bunch of things down on the computer, just literally make little notes or little audio files and have hundreds of them on the computer. And then, you know, just I'd look things up on the web. I mean, I did some of this when I was dealing with Jan, and looked up all sorts of symptoms and things on the web, possible explanations, and didn't particularly meticulously file them. I just filed them as a file, not even with a number. It was just whatever Apple assigned as the name of the file, and it wasn't based on the content. Then I would randomly think, I'm going to let my gut choose one of those messages. Given that this is not scientific, and there wasn't an observer doing it, my overpowering sense was, I am getting better than random at picking answers. I was getting very relevant answers very often. Now, you could make that into a formal experiment and it might disappear. I have no idea, but based on and I was just playing games to see how far it would go. And I did learn to trust a sort of gut reaction, that there was something to that. I can't explain what it was, but more often than I thought was going to happen, because there were hundreds of these things. And I was getting maybe 1 out of 3 that was somewhat relevant, and maybe 1 out of 5 that was very relevant. So it was kind of wild, and I could write an essay explaining why that worked, and it had nothing to do with anything unusual, you know, because there's all sorts of memories you're not aware of and things. So it's something that in principle could be done, but I was certainly left with this strong sense, and we are talking about strong senses and cognition and consciousness, that trusting your gut is a good idea. We know that's true for training. You know, the guys who win the sprints in the Tour de France or the Giro, they're making decisions faster than the brain works. Mark Cavendish has said he was never the fastest sprinter in a field. He had the fastest reaction times to when the other people moved. And he followed one to the other, and he was very fast. He was faster than the brain. That was guts. Literally, his body was doing that. His mind wasn't fast enough. And you get lots of examples like that. So this gut stuff there's something to that.
There's a term of sense making, which I find relevant here, because what you were describing right now is a case of sense making. And one of the things that sense making, as there's a French philosopher, Michel Serres, who's written quite a lot about sense and sense making. And sense making is about being in interaction with the world. And it's about making patterns, like you have just described, right? And I mean, and this is an insight that you also see in management studies, for example. It's not about the map, it's about finding your way, you know, so the map becomes this tool for finding your way. And and that's what you were describing as well. I think that you were describing a process of finding your way.
Yeah.
And that kind of interaction, you can use various kinds of tools, various kinds of prosthetics. And it's not really about what they actually do. It's about you finding your way.
Yeah, that in fact, that's just, I mean, I alluded to that with the work with Dushka, that we used mathematics because the process of trying to do it was useful. So if we stop asking the question, and maybe end of science sort of stuff, if we stop asking the question of what and why and just think about the how, these kind of things may well be the way. Maybe the pursuit of those questions, not to the traditional scientific goal, but to the goal of pursuing those questions, will be good for all of us, individually and as a group. That may be the way science is going to go. I mean, you know, we could say science has had its heyday and it was brilliant, and it may well continue to do things. But maybe we can use this stuff we've got in these societies in a different way. And this consciousness stuff pushes you towards that really quickly.
Great, thank you. I'm going to allow Jesper and Katrine to just make 2 short comments and then a final wrap up from you, Keith, maybe supported. Yeah?
Thank you. My question is fairly quick. I just want to know that this distinction between types and the way we use them, it recalls back to both linguistic and philosophical traditions of signifying signified in linguistic and universals in particular in general philosophy.
Oh, yeah.
Which traditions of those have you carried on over into your model, and how does your model, your model just a more mathematical way of viewing those? No, are they distinct in some way? One of
the co-founders of CSLI was John Perry, very famous philosophy of mind. I got most of my philosophy secondhand from these guys who'd done it. So I mean, I know they were referred to various people, but so I couldn't tell you what Locke said and what various other people said. No. I didn't go that far, and it wasn't my domain. But there was a whole bunch of philosophers there when I went there, and they were they were providing this stuff, and it distilled almost everything I suspect that's been written about and done into that domain. So it was all reflected, but I took it as pre-digested food because that wasn't my domain. I mean, I'd go and ask John Perry sometimes to just nudge me in a certain direction. So I can't answer your question because it was already pre-digested, but it was pre-digested by people who I respected and trusted, and so I just followed them because there's a limited amount of time.
Makes good sense.
But I'm sure it's got to include a lot of that stuff. These things wouldn't have worked well if it hadn't based on that. You know, we had so many applications of that model. It had to have been because all those traditions it was taken from. You can't just make that stuff up. It looks like it afterwards, but it's that's not how it works.
And Katrine, the last comment?
Just a very short, thank you so much, by the way. And I was really inspired by what you said about the word field, particularly. Because for me, it was something, for everyone here, field has we all understand it in a maybe different way. And from studying mathematics, there's a very formal way, as you also mentioned. So this just made me think about this way that, because when I learned mathematics in Danish, at some point I took one course and the word field was translated to Danish. And there we use the word legeme, which actually means body. And when I thought of the English word field, my understanding, my inner picture was a field of flowers. Because I love mathematics, it's a happy place, and you can imagine these vectors, and the field could be, you know, also maybe but you could have a different dimension, fields of different dimensions and so on, a vector field, a topological, all sorts of things. But then this legeme, the Danish word for field, I think it comes from the German mathematicians. It completely changed my idea of a field mathematically. And now that you gave this very nice presentation, I just thought about that
it's also very interesting to think about the physician's idea with like all the other sciences, how they see a field. Maybe a computer scientist would have a different idea.
Yeah, when I went to, I began my undergraduate career in 1965 in London, and it was all done based on abstract definitions of fields. The whole thing was done, formal definition of the numbers, the natural number, the continuous, the real numbers. Things. It was all done with formal methods. What I didn't realize until later is I was being taught by the people who invented that stuff. I was the first generation of students who were taught by the people who'd literally done that stuff. I mean, Russell was still alive, for example, Whitehead was still alive. And it blew me away that this stuff that just seemed so, I thought it went back to Plato. No, it went back to the beginning of the 20th century. And it was a radical redefinition, incredibly effective, but it does cut you off from everything else. As a dean, I used to have to balance the pure mathematicians in the department from the engineers and everybody else whose view of mathematics was really very different. And they wanted to teach calculus very different ways. That's one of the problems you have as a dean, whether or not you're a mathematician, is keeping those people sane, because they both have a point. Although they tend to be a bit intolerant of each other. That's another story. But,
okay, yeah. Keith, thank you so much. What a wonderful and wild closure, or for now a break at least, right?
Yeah, it's wide open.
Yeah. And you're still with us, although you're not going to, come here. You're still with us as adjunct professor.
Sure. Yeah.
And as I have actually written on this little greeting from all of us, this is a gift from FNUG, and you are welcome to be a lifelong member if you want to.
Oh yes, absolutely. Yes.
Yes. Good. All right.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you all.